Well, hey there everybody. I'm really excited about this tutorial today because I'm going to be showing you how to make a beautiful floating teacup with paper flowers. So let me show you first what it's going to look like when it's finished. So here is one of my projects that I did, and I did this one for my mom because she loves the colors blue and lavender. So once this is complete, it's going to look really beautiful. It's going to look like a teacup is floating mid-air, and you're going to have cascading flowers down the center of it, okay? So there's going to be a couple different phases. The first phase here is prepping the teacup so that it is constructed like this, and then the second phase is going to be actually adding all your floral elements to it. So I'm going to start with showing you how to prep the teacup, and then there's going to be a drying period for this, so you're going to take at least a day or two to do this project. So I'm going to show you how I prep it with this teacup, and then I have one already prepped from yesterday that I'm going to show you how I place flowers and foliage and stuff on it. Okay, so I'm going to set this one aside. And I just want to review the supplies for the first bit here. So I have just a basic teacup here of just a normal size. You can use larger ones if you want, but I typically recommend just sort of a traditional teacup. If you don't know where to look for teacups, if you don't have some, I got these off of eBay. They have a whole bunch on there, and you can find some really great styles and patterns and colors and things on there. So check eBay out if you don't have any. So you'll need to have the actual cup, and then of course a saucer to go with it. You're also going to need a fork. Don't use a super expensive fork or anything. You want it to be metal, but you want it to be a little flimsy. Like, you want it to be able to be bent. So something like, you know, a fork from the dollar store or from Target that's just like $1 or $2. It needs to be metal, but it doesn't need to be like a super expensive one where it's like, you know, hard to bend or anything like that. The other items you're going to need for this first part is some either like glass vase fillers or some clear like rocks, anything that's like a vase filler that you might find at a craft store. You can also get these online like Amazon and such. You're going to need this because we're going to use it to weight down as our teacup dries. So there are a lot of other people out there who've done teacup tutorials, and traditionally I've seen a lot of people use a hot glue gun to attach their fork to the teacup. Now, the problem I ran into with this is often the hot glue gun, even if you put a generous amount of glue on it, the hot glue can just peel right away from the glass, because hot glue is really not meant to be used with things like glass traditionally. So what I like to do is I will use a little bit of hot glue just to get it set, but then I will load it up with Gorilla Glue. This is just clear Gorilla Glue, and it works really well with things like glass materials, to where it's almost like an epoxy, but it does take 24 hours to set up. So that's what we're going to be using these rocks for, is to weight down and hold in place our fork, so that when we put this on, everything is going to stay in place while it solidifies and sets up for us. It is also very helpful to have a piece of silicone, like a silicone mat, a piece of a silicone mat, because when we place our rocks on top of the fork area, and I know this doesn't make sense yet, we don't want the glue to stick to the rocks to where we can't get the rocks out. This is just acting as a paperweight to keep things in place. So placing the silicone mat is going to allow you to lift it right up so that it won't stick to any of the glue, and it keeps everything kind of clean. And I'm going to show you that whole process here in just a second. But those are the supplies you need for this first phase that we're doing here. Okay, so the very first step is we need to bend our fork, and I'm just going to show you the easy way that I bend my fork here. Okay, so the best way to easily bend a metal fork is to use the edge of a table. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to focus on curving the top of the fork and sort of creating a slope here at the bottom. A fork has a natural slope to it already, so we're just going to be enhancing that slope down here and then curving this back. And you want to use the leverage of an edge of a table to do this. So like a strong wood table would be probably your best option, like a kitchen table or maybe a countertop or something like that. So I just hold with my hand and I press down. If you have someone in your house who has strong hands and arms, then this is probably a great thing for them to do for you. So it just takes a little bit of work. You can work slowly at it. If you have someone who's stronger, then they probably will be able to do it a lot quicker. And then I'm going to put the fork like this and start bending that down. There we go. All right, so this looks a little bit better. I see I have a nice steep slope right here, and then it gently kind of curves back. And we're going to be placing it there into sort of the center area of the saucer. And now when I hold up where that will be, that's a good spot. So my fork is now bent in a manner that will work with my teacup and saucer. So the next part here, you're going to want to connect your fork to your teacup first. I did this both ways. I've made 2 teacups so far, and I did it where I connected it at the saucer first and then the cup, and then I tried it connecting it to the cup first and then the saucer. The cup definitely is an easier way, so I recommend connecting your fork to your cup before the saucer, okay? And you want to have your Gorilla Glue nearby, your silicone piece nearby, some weighted rocks nearby, and your glue gun, okay? And inside a lot of teacups, there's sort of a little bump you'll be able to feel when you stick your finger inside. We want to stay as flush with the fork and the teacup as possible. So make sure you're not pushing this so far up that it sort of creates a gap, and then it will make the fork more unstable. So you only probably want to go in about an inch, inch and a half into the teacup. And this might vary depending on what your teacup looks like, but that's what mine is going to be, is about an inch and a half into the teacup there. I am going to start with adding a little bit of hot glue, and then I'm going to load it up with Gorilla Glue, and then put my rock weights in there with the silicone mat. Okay, so I'm just going to load it up here. A little bit of hot glue first. And it's a good idea with the hot glue step to just hold it for a good 30 seconds or so to make sure that it's, making good contact. And if you try and stand this up, it's going to tip. So just be mindful of that. I recommend resting it on its side so that you're not putting any pressure on the fork or the teacup when you're doing this step. So I'm just going to hold it while I add on my Gorilla Glue. You can get the Gorilla Glue online. You can get it at like Walmart's and Targets and places like that too. Even I think Home Depot sells it. So I'm just going to add a bunch right along the seam, along the top. And it's going to want to like move. The Gorilla Glue is very a lot like liquid, so it is going to kind of move different directions on you. So it is a good idea to try and have a plan to keep it leveled while this dries. I like to, at this point, we're going to go ahead and put in our silicone mat. I'm just going to stick that right in there. And I'm going to start loading it with these rocks because I want to make sure that that fork keeps contact exactly where I want it while this is drying for the next several hours. Okay, so anything like weighted beads, anything like that that'll make good contact, help keep this weighted in place. So then you can use anything for this. You could use like a container, a book, anything on hand. You just want to sort of get something that you can rest this on. I like to sort of do it like this so that the glue on the inside here isn't going to pool to the back. It's going to stay where we where we put it, right on top of the fork, because we want it to, of course, keep the fork glued. So find something like a book to rest it on, or a container, or another glass to where you can keep it kind of at this leveled angle while it dries. And you just want to set this aside and let it alone for at least 12 hours. I recommend 24 if you can. So I'm just going to set this aside. Okay, so it's nearly 24 hours later now, and I'm going to pull these rocks out. Silicone and everything. And now you can see our fork is nice and stable, and it's not going anywhere. So the next step is going to be to put it here into the center of the teacup saucer, and you're just going to repeat the process with adding a little hot glue first, Gorilla Glue, putting something weighted on top of it, and then waiting about 12 to 24 hours. And then just the same thing as we did with this one, let's just add some Gorilla Glue around the edges, really load it up there. And then you'll want to place that silicone mat on top. And you can add the weighted rocks. I ended up using another mug to kind of hold it in place. Now for this part here, once you placed your weighted item on top, you want to lean this against something like a wall, or just anything that's going to support this teacup, because even with something weighted here, it's still going to want to tip back. So find like a wall you can lean it against so that this teacup is supported while this is weighting it down and you're waiting for the glue to dry. So now that you know how to connect your fork to your saucer and teacup, we need to talk about how to get your teacup to stand up on its own. So I tried this 2 or 3 different ways, where I really tried to make sure that the teacup was as close to the center of the saucer as possible so that it wouldn't do this tipping thing that it's doing right now. And even with as much as I did that and as much as I bent the fork up, I still dealt with teetering issues here, and it just ultimately wasn't super stable, which obviously we don't want to worry about this falling over, or someone walking by a table and it just, falls over from somebody walking by. So what I do at this step, and it sort of has a 2-purpose process, it actually worked out better than I thought, is I take those same rocks that we were using as our weights in the first part, and I glue with hot glue these rocks until the weight of the rocks acts as a counterweight to the teacup back here. And this worked out really well for another reason, because if you notice with your saucer, it sort of goes down to the center where there's like a bit of a curve down in the center of the dish there. And by putting these rocks here, you are going to be able to raise that center up so that when we add our greenery and our paper flowers, it's not going to look like it's sinking into the middle, but rather that it's sort of filling up like we would be filling up a teacup. So just get enough rocks or vase fillers or whatever it is you might be using for this part to test first that the weight is enough counterweight. So I'm just going to keep adding rocks until I feel it not wanting to tip back. You can use like the smooth clear vase fillers too. I just ended up grabbing these. I think this is what I had on hand at the time. So I'm just gonna, and all this is gonna be covered. So it doesn't matter if it looks messy. It doesn't matter if it doesn't look pretty. It doesn't matter at all, because you're not gonna see any of this, okay? So there we go. I've added a pretty generous amount of rocks there, and it's not wanting to tip back. And there'll be a little extra weight added on top because of course we're gonna add greenery and paper flowers. But you wanna make sure it feels pretty stable as is. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm just gonna start gluing down these rocks. So I'm just gonna pick these up, and you can use hot glue for this part. You don't have to use Gorilla Glue for this part, because we're not dealing with something floating out here in space, where you're trying to make sure that nothing's gonna break off because of the weight. So I just keep adding a generous amount of glue and just place these down until you get all these rocks glued down, just like so. So I have all of my rocks glued down here. Everything feels good and stable, nothing's tipping. So that's exactly what we want. And at this point, we're gonna start adding our foliage, greenery, and paper flowers and everything to it. So I'm gonna show you the first step to that. Let me set this aside for a second. I highly recommend getting something like some green moss from your craft store or online, and maybe even a few like small detailed silk flowers, just to create a good cover of greenery at the base to place the paper flowers on top of. So I always start with some green moss at the bottom, and then I add some like paper leaves and some other little silk details, and then I start adding on the paper flowers. So first thing I do is I just grab a handful. It's a little messy. Just get a good amount of moss. And you make this in different sort of like textures and sizes and things, so you can get whatever kind of texture or color that you prefer. And first check that you have enough to cover everything. So that looks pretty good. Kind of covers everything really well there. You can see how you can't even see the rocks at this point, and we're going to be adding that much more stuff to it still. So I'm just going to pull this off, and obviously this is kind of an abstract material, so there's not an exact place to glue down, so I just drop some glue all over the top of these rocks, and then I just press it into the rocks. So again, you can use hot glue for this. And I just sort of go to town, scattering some hot glue. And then grab that handful and place it right on top. Sort of push it down right into the glue there. And this will be held on that much better as we add our paper flowers, because we'll be adding glue to those, and that glue will sort of be seeping into the moss and connecting it more even to the bottom of the rock in the teacup saucer area there. Okay. To get this down, the next step is going to be to add a little bit of paper greenery if you want to. This is optional, of course. You can play around with however you want. I like to add a little paper greenery and also a little bit of silk greenery here. So I have a little paper greenery cut out. You can just use some vines. I have a bunch of vines and leaves in my shop. I'm going to link the stuff I used here below if you want to use what I'm using. And I also have some freebies on the blog that I'll make sure I include as well into the blog post for this. So first you just kind of want to play with it. You want to get an idea of how you want it to look. So for one example, I have this sort of whimsical vine here, and I kind of think about just sort of setting it on top of that greenery to give it sort of help the transition from this moss greenery into the paper elements that we have going on here. And then I think about taking some of this silk baby breath and trimming some of that down, and just along the outer edges I think, okay, maybe that would look nice to sort of put that on the outer edges just to sort of finish that moss edge off a little bit. So this is just what I would do. You do whatever you feel works for you. This is just kind of how I created my first one that you saw at the beginning of this tutorial. And I'm just laying out right now. I don't think I want to use those leaves yet because I have a lot going on. So I'm going to go ahead and attach this down as is. So for this part, I'm just going to come right in here and add a little bit of hot glue and go in and stick that on. Okay, there we go. So that's a good start. And now comes the really fun and pretty part with the flowers. So I made a lot of little mini flowers for this tutorial here. I used some of my Ruby Rose templates and my rosette templates. They work really well when you shrink them down and make little mini sizes here. And just a few other little items here that I just sort of mixed and matched some of my templates with. I will link all of the templates that I used for this, and there are tutorials on all of them individually, so I'm not going to walk you through how to build each of these flowers because there's already video tutorials on all of that. I'll just make sure to include that below. I have a free rosette template on the blog. If you don't want to buy anything or don't have any of my templates already, you can download a free one on the blog to just do some rosettes to try out. There's a couple of vines on the blog for free. But I use the Ruby Rose template here and the rosettes for these tutorials. So I'm just going to grab these, and you want to think about your color coordination when you do this. I have a green teacup here with gold elements, a lot of greenery, so I wanted something that was going to contrast. And when you look at the colors of the rainbow, things like yellow and reds and pinks are a good contrast to greens and golds. So that's what I decided to go with here so that it would contrast well with my teacup that I already had. So I'm just going to bring these over, and I always lay everything out first to get an idea before I start to glue down. So obviously it's going to look a little different once you actually glue it down, but I just kind of like to get a pattern of how my flowers are going to lay. I have a vague idea now of how I want my flowers to be laid out on the teacup and what I'm going to be putting up here. You might want to take like a picture with your phone if you can't remember how you're going to place everything, or you could lift one up at a time and then glue it down. So I'm just going to pull mine off and then start gluing it down. Okay. I do recommend starting up here first, just because it's easier to build off of what's coming down. So I'm going to start with this one up at the top. You can use hot glue for this part again, and I'm going to get this right up in the top and just aim so that everything is being covered up as far as like the fork and everything is being covered up there. Alright, once it starts to get really full and filled out and everything, just before you start adding any bigger flowers, just kind of look for spaces where you might want to reserve that space for some extra leaves or greenery. Take a look up in here and see if there's anywhere you want to add greenery. One flower I do recommend having on hand is my hydrangeas, because they are nice and tiny and they're easy to sort of just kind of pinch together and fill all those little spots in. So I love to use my hydrangea template to fill in some spaces. So that's what I'm going to do now, is I'm just going to start filling these spaces out. Okay, so I'm just going to take some of the leaves that I have now. I just have these spare leaves that I've had laying around, and I'm just going to look to see if there's anywhere that they fit kind of naturally into things. So again, I'll link a bunch of templates below that I used for this if you're seeing things here that you would love to use as well. Nice and full. I feel like it looks pretty good as is. You don't want to obviously overkill. Less is more usually. So I feel like it looks really good as is. I'm really happy with it. You know, you could add some other details to this, like if you wanted to add little paper butterflies to it. I have templates for those as well. Or if you wanted to even put like maybe some twinkle lights around the base somehow, like a really small strand to sort of light it up, I think that would be really cool. But this is the process of how I make my floating teacups. So here's the one we just made together, and here is the one that I showed you in the beginning. You can see they each turned out uniquely different. You can see this one turned out a little bit higher than this one. It's just the way I ended up bending my fork. So you can play around with the heights and depths of everything, and that is exactly how I make these beautiful little cascading flower teacups. I really hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Feel free to check out the templates I have below. Feel free to hop over to the blog. There's a whole post on this. It gives details and links for everything, so if you have questions, be sure to check that out. They're likely to be answered in there. So I will see you guys in the next video.